And to all of you for listening to the talk. So this is work in progress, and I'm particularly excited to get feedback from this group. This is kind of at the intersection of philosophy of social science, AI, and ethics, and maybe the kind of philosophy of sciences that are lurking in the background. So I'd love to kind of tease it out and chat about it, but work in progress. So excited to get questions. I'll definitely not talk, over the hour, but try to talk for a bit less because I would really love to have a lot of time for questions. All right, so the talk is decision thresholds and fairness. So there's this idea that you find both in, computer and social science, as well as in the kind of popular discussion of these things, that fairness really requires accurate prediction. And a lot of the problem with unfairness is that we have inaccurate predictions, say, because of some contingent facts about group membership, data availability, a variety of issues. But if we could do more accurate prediction, this is kind of crucial. This is a necessary step to doing fair prediction. So, take a case of hiring across different disciplines, accurate prediction, say accurately predicting the best or most deserving candidate has been argued to promote values like individual welfare, some kind of social welfare, maybe for reasons of comparative efficiency, we want to hire the people who will perform this job best, but importantly, fairness. So here the kind of, first pass thought is like, look, you worked really hard, you're so qualified, you don't get chosen through no fault of your own, even though that you're the most qualified person for this job. Isn't this deeply unfair? And I think this goes with a lot of people's intuitions as well. So I now don't have a citation, but you can see some experiments where if somebody who's kind of viewed as less deserving is given something over someone who's more deserving, actually that person who's, seen as less deserving and gets the thing will also themselves report that there's some kind of unfairness here. So accurate prediction, really crucial to fairness. So this also the kind of, new Kahneman, Sunstein, and third author's name I always forget, book Noise. This idea is really just if we can reduce noise, we would have fairness. But I think, that's also at the same time recognized in the social sciences and computer science that there's an important role for randomness. So I've just listed a few places that you might see this, by far not an exhaustive list. So it's recognized in computer science that if you're using some kind of threshold to convert a prediction into a decision, the placing of a threshold is itself a little bit arbitrary. So on either side of that threshold, it's going to be a little bit arbitrary whether somebody, didn't get the kind of decision, a favorable decision, or did. So, take a loan, we say, okay, we want to pick out the people who are going to pay back the loan. We put the threshold at like people who are 70% likely to pay back the loan. But maybe around that threshold, someone who's, all those 69% people, they're basically as likely as all those 70.2% people. So there's a little bit of kind of arbitrariness. Maybe we need to kind of add some randomness to get over this problem of sharp thresholds. We kind of need some fuzziness here. So some recent work also by Kleinberg and Raghavan that I'll talk a little bit about later. But their idea is having some kind of single criterion kind of decision rule is actually bad for overall social welfare. The idea is, you've got a bunch of employers who would kind of benefit, important assumption, they benefit from people with slightly different skills, but they all rank the kind of top person as first, and second and third, according to just one set of criteria. They're missing out all those people who had like slightly different skills that were very low ranked, that weren't picked out by this criterion, but actually would have suited them nicely. So the idea is actually using the same ranking for multiple decisions can reduce social welfare as well. And finally, it's kind of recognized in, for example, the economics literature on mechanism design, that when individuals have equal entitlements, key assumption, equal entitlements to some good, it's fair if all individuals have some kind of equal chances, either ex ante or ex post, at their preferred good. So here are the kind of examples in mechanism design I'm thinking of are, say that you need a fair way to allocate, in the US where students compete and share rooms, like rooms in universities, You think, okay, well, no university student has like a higher claim to a better room. They're all kind of equally entitled to a room that roughly satisfies their preferences. So how can we come up for the fair mechanism, a fair kind of allocation procedure, such that given they all have this kind of entitlement, that expectation is satisfied? So the idea is, look, if people have equal entitlements, then actually we ought to use some kind of random, procedure. Random either over the kind of ex ante ordering or perhaps some kind of ex post randomness. So I got really interested in this just bigger question: when does adding randomness to algorithmic prediction or decision systems promote moral values? And I'm just going to take a very narrow stab at that question today. So our two main claims that I'll discuss the first defended in much more detail. So the first is algorithmic decision-making that uses decision thresholds to convert predictions into decisions. I'll discuss that when it comes later, is unfair when, because those with some claim to the good have no chance at it. Second, there are some epistemic and justice-based reasons to build some genuine randomness into our decision systems. I'm going to flag, I'm not going to consider trade-offs with other values. So this is just going to be a presentation about fairness. You may want to come back and say, well, good, fairness is all well and good, but we recognize in a lot of these cases, like welfare is really driving the decision-making, in which case maybe we would disagree about that, but in any case, I'm not addressing those kind of other values you might care about. And I'll also flag, although I'll kind of stress this throughout the talk, I think the kind of role or the notion of randomness is playing a different sort of role in these two arguments. In the first argument, the idea is, well, people have kind of different strengths of claim to some good. So it would be kind of unfair if some people kind of got the thing and others had no chance. That doesn't mean we should have a completely random decision process, like we take into account no characteristics of you and we just roll the dice. For the second kind of set of arguments, I'm going to consider something more that I call genuine randomness, whatever that means, but it's more like rolling the dice, ignoring a bunch of facts about you and just rolling the dice, or in the kind of Sunstein Kahneman language, deliberately adding some noise to our decision procedure. All right, so the plan for today, the argument that decision thresholds are unfair. So first, in roughly 10 minutes, I'll discuss what is fairness. Second, why this conception of fairness is helpful for AI fairness debates. Third, argue decision thresholds are unfair, really just falls out pretty quickly from the conception of fairness that we'll be discussing, and then sum up. And then two, just kind of throw out some epistemic and justice-based reasons for adding some genuine randomness, but I'm really, interested in ones that I've overlooked, as well as, of course, challenged. Okay, so first section, decision thresholds are unfair. What is fairness? So here, I'm working with an account from John Broome. So John Broome is working within a paradigm where we're thinking about goods in particular. So, John Broome, with his training as an economist, is thinking, people are competing over things like jobs or dorm rooms or kidneys, things where we have a limited supply. There's some kind of scarcity, either natural or artificial. And so fairness questions arise because we recognize, look, people can't all have this thing that they want, like, the job that they want. I shouldn't use jobs in academic context. It's kind of cruel. A kidney, they can't all have the kidney, even though there are lots of needy people. So we need to kind of make decisions in some way that are respecting people's claims. So for Broome, two aspects of this definition are really crucial for me. Actually, one is really crucial, one I'm going to kind of gloss over. So the first is it's about claims. I'll say a bit about what claims are, but importantly, claims are things that are owed to individuals. You can think of them as kind of rights, but also maybe interests that are determined by people's needs, by facts about deserve, by agreements, promises, these kind of things. And then the really crucial part for my argument is Broom's commitment that claims need to be respected in proportion to their strengths. So when we've got something, be it a job, credit, we need to allocate the good in a way that respects people's different strengths of claims. All right, so for claims, I'm not going to say too much about it, but just to kind of distinguish allocation via claims from, say, a kind of welfare-driven reasons you have to allocate goods. So this is just an example modified from Broom. So say there's an elite group of firefighters who've been called to save a cat from a very tall tree with thin branches. Elise is the best climber and the lightest. There are reasons to allocate the task to her, reasons of overall welfare. She's less likely to be hurt. We want the poor cat to be saved. Firefighters are always saving cats. That's their main job. She needs to save it. However, stipulate none of the individuals has a claim to not be assigned to the task, or another way to put it, they're all kind of equally on the hook to do it. They're all firefighters. They knew when they signed up, being a firefighter is about rescuing cats, so they're all equally liable to rescue the cat. The reason to assign the task to Elise are not reasons of fairness. They're these reasons of kind of overall welfare, comparative efficiency. All right, so the important bit for my argument is this Broomian idea, and I think this is really the weird, but hopefully you find compelling aspect of the Broomian view. So goods need to be allocated in kind of proportion to the strength of people's claims. So it's, I think, natural in the case of divisible goods to want to divide goods in this way and to kind of have a sense of what this means. So say that Ahmed owes Dinesh 200 pounds and he owes Carl 100 pounds. He's only got 60 pounds. What should he do? Arguably, he should be kind of paying them back in turn, kind of roughly in proportion to what he owes them. Let's just stipulate for this case. So he owes, Dinesh twice as much as he owes Carl. So he should give Dinesh 40 of his pounds he has to pay back to them and Carl 20. So it's kind of easier in the case of divisible goods. You could say, well, I don't know, take another case. Sylvia is a marathon runner. She needs to eat a lot of calories. We have a certain amount of food to divide between us. And I know we've got all this pasta, but you've got the marathon tomorrow. So you've got kind of roughly like, twice the claim I do to this pasta. So I'll just give you double the amount of pasta. We've got a divisible good. It's kind of easy to respect claims in this way. What on earth would this mean for indivisible goods? Where a thing, you can't like split, the kidney's not going to be as effective if we divide it amongst two of you, so we need to give the kidney to just one person. There's that parable, right? Can't divide the baby, can't also divide the kidney. It's just one indivisible thing needs to go to someone. But people have differing strengths of claims. How do we adjudicate them? So say, a kind of parallel. Say Ahmed promised to pick Dinesh up from the airport on Monday and Carl on Tuesday. Carl's flight is changed to arrive at the same time as Dinesh's on Monday, but to a different airport. So just feature that I'm stipulating about this case. Carl still has a kind of residual claim to be picked up from the airport, maybe because his flight changed, the kind of promise is not completely gone, but it's weaker. So, Ahmed still has some kind of promise to Carl to pick him up, but arguably a stronger promise to Dinesh since he originally made the promise to her to pick her up at that particular time. But, they're both relying on him. Ahmed, he's stuck. How does he adjudicate these claims? The kind of Broomian intuition here is to flip a weighted coin. So the key thing here is you don't always just go for the person with the strongest claim. You need to use weighted lotteries where the weights are in proportion to the strength of the claims. So, here you might have a just standard objection. So you might say lotteries should only be used to break ties. So the kind of standard position in the literature is that it's only justifiable to use lotteries to break ties between equally strong claims to indivisible goods. So recall our funny college dorm room problem. We said, yeah, sure, it's okay to use a lottery to divide college dorm rooms among students. You can tell this is an American college dorm room because there's football gear and football on the TV. Sorry, yeah, the other kind of football. But that's just because they had equally strong claims. Of course, this kind of objection goes, and I think this is the standard position both in the literature in philosophy and also the literatures in economics, in some social sciences, that because the people with the strongest claim just always ought to get the good in question. So here I think, I'm going to motivate that I think actually Broom's account of fairness is maybe particularly apt when we're thinking about problems that AI raises, when we're using algorithmic systems to make decisions. But I still want to at least kind of, I can't give, I sadly, if anyone has one, I would love one. I don't have a decisive argument that the Broomian conception of fairness is just always, over and above better than this other one that says give people with the strongest claim the good. I think it's going to depend a lot on the kind of institutional context, various facts. But here's one thing that I think, at least for me, kind of gets me into thinking, yeah, it would be unfair if the person who had the strongest claim always got the good in question. And these are kind of dynamic considerations of decision-making over time. So, maybe this doesn't work for you, but at least in these kind of one-off cases, when you've got two people with a claim to a kidney and we allocate it to the person with the stronger claim, I think there often the thought is like, yeah, we did something right. The person with the strongest claim always ought to get the good in question. That's the kind of account of fairness that we want to have. That really strong view, I think, at least I find less plausible in the case of repeated decisions. So imagine a system, a society where we've got a healthcare system. We give it a bunch of, say, explicit rules for identifying who ought to be prioritized to be given the kidney, say, who's kind of sickest, however we're understanding what that is. And our healthcare system is just perfect at identifying those with the greatest claim to a kidney and always allocates the kidney to them. And there are never enough kidneys for those with weaker claims. And you know that if you end up sick with a kind of somewhat serious disease, that you benefit from a new kidney, but you know that people with kind of more serious diseases will always get them. I think here I at least find something troubling about this kind of system, and that the person who knows from the start that they'll have no chance at the good in question does have a complaint. And it's a fairness-based complaint. So here, Kai Spiekerman, for example, argues that always allocating the good to those with the strongest claim is just not justifiable to the losers. When we're thinking about setting up a fair decision system that respects everyone's claims, if you say, yeah, this is how we're going to make decision, and just from the offset, ex ante that you've got zero chance at ever getting the thing you want. This just isn't fair to the kind of people who are always going to lose out. That's at least the intuition here. Okay, so I think to give a little bit more argument about why this kind of conception of fairness is useful to consider, I'm going to draw on some considerations from algorithmic fairness and say it's particularly helpful to help us think about questions of fairness when it comes to allocating goods with algorithms. So hopefully a bit more argument beyond intuition. Okay, so why is this account, the Broomian account of fairness, particularly helpful for the algorithmic fairness literature? I think at least 3 reasons. So the first is my rational reconstruction. I think it makes sense of a strand of research on algorithmic fairness. The second is that AI, the use of AI to make decisions tends to produce monocultures. I'll say what that means, but I think this kind of monocultural decision making gives us strong reasons to go with the Broomian approach. And third, the use of AI can strengthen already strong claims and weaken weaker claims over time. And this should also make us concerned. And the Broomian approach would counteract this. Okay. So first, algorithmic fairness. So as I'm thinking about it, algorithmic fairness is a research program in computer science that has had a lot of practical influence in industry and government. So it aims to connect the kind of following accounts of algorithmic bias. So first, the hope is to define some kind of deviation of an algorithm's performance from what's required by some standard, and then use that deviation from the algorithm's performance from what's required by some standard to identify types of troubling bias to the encoding of wrongfully discriminatory social patterns into an algorithm. So the idea is, AI is so wonderful because it learns from data, so problematic because it learns from data. Within all this wonderful data we have is embedded these kind of wrongfully discriminatory social patterns. So what we need to do is define some kind of standard of performance that we can use to detect when we have the kind of encoding of wrongfully discriminatory social patterns. And a common strategy is to measure whether an already learned model is fair by examining observable inequalities between groups in error rates. So kind of rough idea, if we're making kind of a greater proportion of errors about one group or certain types of errors, then maybe we've encoded these kind of wrongfully discriminatory social patterns. So if, for example, we've got a hiring algorithm and we don't hire people of, say, one gender, then we might think, well, we've made a bunch of where we've got a kind of roughly equal candidate pool across different ways of carving up genders. And we think, okay, well, we've got some kind of observable inequality between groups and error rates, so we know that some kind of encoding of wrongfully discriminatory social patterns has gone on here. So the kind of, much discussed example in this domain is the Compass Risk Assessment, a model that was developed by a private company for use in the US criminal justice system in order to inform decisions about, for example, bail. So say that you're arrested for stealing a bike. Information about you is fed into a Compass risk assessment system, which outputs a score of how likely you are to be arrested in the future between 1 and 10. And the judge releases anyone on bail who has a score under 7. And what ProPublica found for this algorithm is that on one plausible definition of fairness, the thing looked to be biased against African-American defendants. So there was a higher proportion of African-Americans who were labeled high risk, but in fact didn't reoffend, so a greater number of false positives for the high risk category. But when you looked at people who are labeled lower risk, but actually did reoffend, there's a much higher proportion of white Americans who are lower risk, yet did reoffend false negatives than African Americans. So the idea is, we found some really troubling bias here. But this kicked off this whole really fascinating debate. And the reason why it, kicked up a whole debate is that by ProPublica's preferred metric, that of calibration, the algorithm, the model was actually calibrated, but by ProPublica's preferred fairness metric, equalized odds, it wasn't. So just to kind of give a sense of where these two different fairness metrics are coming from, the idea of calibration is meant to encode this idea of a kind of equal evidential value of a score or fair testing. So the notion of calibration is that the score corresponds to the same probability of the outcome, kind of regardless of the social identity of people. So if you were labeled, a 6, regardless of your social identity, you'd better have the same kind of rough probability of getting that outcome than someone else from another group. Whereas equalized odds was really concerned with the rates of false positives or negatives, as we saw on the previous slide, conditional on the kind of outcomes regardless of social identity. And here I think it's really thinking this kind of claim sort of way, people are the same with respect to outcomes, ought to have a kind of equal chance at the thing. And it's unfair if you have a higher chance of being, a false positive or a false negative, regardless of your kind of, just because of your social identity. So I think, when we're thinking about algorithmic fairness, there are two kinds of fairness projects that you could have. And the first one has gotten far, far more attention. So this kind of notion of equal, fairness is equal treatment, the idea that fairness is a matter of treating like cases alike. If, Emma and Sylvia both are equally qualified for a job, but I kind of don't choose one of them on spurious grounds. I treat them very differently. I treat one of them as unqualified. Plausibly, I've done something deeply unfair and importantly unfair. So this kind of notion that any kind of test we use ought to have equal evidential value is really bound up with this concept of equal treatment. I think, side note, the notion of a test, in the case of like the social world having equal evidential value, I think is a really interesting one that is worth teasing out, but I'm not going to do in the talk today. Seems calibration is like a really useful notion for thermometers. What exactly it means for hiring, I'm not quite sure. But in any case, I'm going to focus on the second kind of idea of fairness that both also go back to Aristotle, this idea of satisfying claims or giving each their due. And I think that this kind of account of thinking about differences in error rates across groups is really concerned with people not getting their due for spurious reason, even if the kind of the test that we has like equal evidential value. It's still a problem if someone, correlated with their kind of social group identity has a higher chance of not getting what they're due, having a kind of, falsely being turned down for the job. So that's kind of thought one, that actually this Broomian notion, the idea of, satisfying claims and giving each their due is really what Broom is concerned with. And then for him, he also, adds the qualification that giving each their due, like in proportion to the strength of their claim. So second, why I think the Broom notion is really helpful for thinking about algorithmically driven decision-making is that we should be very concerned about what's been called algorithmic monocultures. So features of how AI systems learn plus kind of broader socioeconomic facts will lead to so-called algorithmic monocultures. The idea of an algorithmic monoculture is, so Kleinberg and Ragavan model it after a, crop monoculture. The idea is you look at your decision-making ecosystem, but all we find are the same inference and decision rules across different decision makers, and this has bad effects for our decision-making ecosystem. This kind of homogeneity in decision rules is a bad thing. That's something we should be concerned about. Okay. Why should we think it arises? Actually, I started this project thinking it's really because of features of kind of, AI and the learning process narrowly conceived. I think it's actually more about the kind of wider political and economic environment. Still, there might be some things about AI that lead to, a kind of tendency towards these monocultures. So, one feature is if you've got an algorithmic decision-making system, the kind of benefit, but also in this case, bad of the system is that it's going to ignore individualized evidence, or to put it differently, it uses the same limited features across predictions. So of course, if you've got an, credit scoring system for each person, we need to enter the data, the model needs to have the data in a certain kind of accessible form, and it relies on the same data for each type of person. So for, you work at a bank, you've got someone before you, you just ask them a kind of standardized list of questions. I'm told this is how it goes with like mortgage applications. You just ask them a standardized list of questions, you plug the answers into the computer system, you press the button, the system kind of calculates their suitability for the loan and outputs the score to you. There's no kind of, extra box that says, and enter any additional information that we may not have asked about, that's not covered under these questions. So for your system, you might, for individual decisions, you might have thought, well, the reason we didn't get these kind of algorithmic monocultures is when you've got an individual making a decision, usually they can draw on this kind of what we'll just loosely call individualized evidence that's in front of them as input to the decision. So they have kind of factors about, okay, I work for a bank and I know that you, given your income percentile, are thus and so likely to pay back a loan because of these kind of generalizations about how high income people are better able to pay back loans. But maybe also working for the bank, I have some kind of evidence like, what's a good example? You have kind of wealth from another country that's not part of my, intake form, but that you could draw on to pay back the loan if you're going to go bankrupt. So I know I've got this kind of individualized evidence that's not part of the standard assessment, but I can use to make this decision. So, this kind of individualized evidence, we have reason to be worried because often, these are kind of places for bias to creep in. But it also means that we're less likely to get these kind of algorithmic monocultures because an individual decision maker can kind of take into account both the standard generalizations that they know about how features of the individual are tied to certain outcomes, but also evidence that's more particular to that individual. And note, I should say that because of the learning kind of features of the learning process, we ought to also be worried that we're not going to, in some cases, get very accurate algorithmic monocultures. So just because we get a kind of standardized decision-making system doesn't mean that it's a good decision-making system. AI is, vulnerable to kind of data issues. The kind of learned model is only going to be as good as the data that you give it to learn on, and as Cynthia Rubin has argued, because AI systems need a lot of data, we have reason to expect that the quality of data will be worse just because, for data quality, we often rely on kind of human collectors and cleaners of the data, and people will just have time, less time for big data sets in order to do that responsibly. Or we might be worried about when it comes to AI overfitting. We've got some kind of model that learned what's a good employee from, a sample of, so many employees, but it may have just picked up on arbitrary facts about them that we then use to make our decisions. So getting a kind of, just because you have an algorithmic monoculture doesn't mean you're going to get a kind of accurate decision system. But I actually think we have more reason to expect these algorithmic monocultures just because of wider features of the economic and political environment in which AI is being used. So as Creel and Hellman discuss, data is really expensive to gather and to transform into a kind of usable form. So algorithm designers tend to use the same data sets. They also might not have access, there might be kind of, they might need to purchase them. They can't kind of collect the data on their own. They don't have the ability to. And if you've got structured data sets, they're just going to rely on the same features as well. So because even if you've got different companies kind of doing their own modeling, projects, still they're using the same data sets. So you'd expect for them to learn pretty similar models, depending on the assumptions they make. Often these companies have market monopolies that result from data monopolies. So you can only build a kind of good model if you've got enough data. A lot of companies don't have enough data. So often, companies and government agencies only have a few algorithmic systems to choose from. If you're buying something to help you do hiring, it's going to be, HireVue or one of the other few companies who are doing this. And once an AI system is integrated into a decision process, it's really cheap and fast to use, but it's costly to integrate this AI system. So, for example, Virginia Eubanks has nicely chronicled an example of when Kansas, there was a US state who wanted to replace its kind of human-driven welfare assessment with an algorithmically driven one, kind of purchased and just spent huge amounts of money totally transforming the ways in which they did, welfare assessment, training people to use this system. System turned out to be terrible, but they're like, well, we spent the whole state budget for the next 5 years on the system, so now we're kind of stuck with not the whole state budget on the system, but we can't allocate any more money to redoing it. So we're stuck with this thing. So once you've got an AI system, it is true that they're kind of cheap and fast to use to make decisions. I think this is actually largely the kind of benefit of algorithmic hiring. It's in many cases not more accurate, it's just faster. But that's after the cost of integrating the system into your decision process. All right, so and I should say, you know, why does this fact of monocultures mean that we should be kind of particularly amenable to the Broomian account of fairness? Well, if you thought that, you know, there's a little bit of something to the idea that it's just not fair if you have a weaker claim to know that, you know, ex ante you'll just have no chance at getting the relevant thing like a job or a loan or a kidney. We might have thought, well, in the past, you know, people didn't face these kind of decision monocultures. You went to, you know, you applied to a bunch of different jobs, all these different, you know, committees were using slightly different criteria. So there was some kind of randomness baked into the, you know, decision process, even if you didn't have a chance at, you know, this one particular job, other people would value different things, and you would have had a shot. So you didn't have a complaint. Whereas these algorithmic monocultures, we've got a kind of deep and pervasive standardization that means that, you know, beforehand, we can see, and even as they're used over time, get a sense of like, okay, well, I'm applying for a bunch of jobs at, you know, Boots and similar kinds of stores, but I know that the hiring system that all these places use heavily punish being out of work. I was out of work for an illness. So I had a good reason, but still, because of the kind of single set of decision criteria they use, I know I'll just never have a chance at a job at one of these places because I was out of the labor market for long enough. So I think we should be kind of particularly worried when it comes to algorithmic monocultures, and the Broomian, we should expect there to be a lot of algorithmic monocultures, and so Broom is a kind of nice pushback against them. All right. So final reason why I think the Broomian account of fairness is really interesting for thinking about AI. So AI systems can strengthen and weaken claims over time. So the first reason for this are so-called feedback loops, which lead to strong claims getting stronger over time and weaker claims getting weaker. So, you know, from a feedback loop, the idea is that the kind of implementation of the system kind of influences the social system in question, which then kind of sends signals back to the decision system, the model, to kind of support the view of how the social system is working, which then, of course, better conforms to it, and so on and so forth. So just two examples. So Google search aims to give users the most relevant results, where relevance is partly operationalized in terms of the number of clicks that something gets. So the highest ranked website gets more clicks. So there's been a lot of experimental work showing that. I didn't have time to cite any of it, but it's been a lot of work showing that people just tend to kind of click on the first thing that's given to them, thus making them more relevant. So over time, they're, you know, the kind of, say you're a company who ends up being shown first all of the time, then all of a sudden you drop in the ranking to 7th, right? It seems like you have a really kind of strong complaint to Google, but look, I was so much relevant because over time, people just kept clicking on my website. Second, a hiring system uses time unemployed to predict which job candidates will stay at the job. Those who spent longer unemployed get poorer predictive scores, so they're not hired, so they spend more time out of work. So they're predicted to not be employable, so again, they don't get hired. So here we have a kind of negative feedback loop where we've got someone who had, say, still some claim to the job in question, but a weaker claim than others, get a kind of weaker and weaker claim over time because of the activity of the decision system. And secondly, these kind of interconnected decision processes that our modern technological system, you know, ecosystems enable also have a similar effect of strengthening strong claims and weakening weak claims. So take, for example, credit reports, which are used in hiring, or Barbara Kiviat, sociologist, has studied in insurance decisions. So for example, if you have a kind of lower credit score, you've got a credit report that reflects this kind of lower credit score, you're then not hired for a job, but having an income in order to pay back your credit is a factor in what your credit score is, which generates your credit report. So we get this kind of feedback loop as well, but which I think is particularly pervasive because of these interconnected decision processes. You get a feedback loop between kind of different decisions. So again, the reason that I think we should be concerned here is that, in these kind of cases, it's both that people with weaker claims, kind of never had a chance, but because of the way that the system, the kind of, decision system, and then the kind of social world that it's modeling or interacting, the people with stronger claims just keep getting kind of, stronger and stronger over time and weaker. So again, in this case, it's maybe particularly perverse because it's not just the people with weaker claims had no chance, but their chance is getting worse over time because they never had a chance. All right. So with the kind of Broomian conception of fairness in mind, as well as this motivation that is particularly helpful for us to think about AI, we're now going to get to the argument that the decision thresholds are unfair. Okay, so algorithmic systems are, first and foremost, not decision systems, right? They're just predicting the way that the world is or is going to be. And then, either kind of automatically or a human will take that prediction and use it to make a decision. So call a decision function something that's used to convert some kind of prediction into a decision, a kind of purported fact around the world into a decision about what to do. So here we've got a classic decision threshold, you must be this tall to ride by yourself. And a common way to do this is to use a threshold. So we've got, say, some kind of continuous prediction, like, you're the percent likely you are to pay back a loan. And then we just say, well, if you're over 70% likely to pay back the loan, we convert that into a yes decision. If you're below 70% likely, we convert that into a no decision. So there's been a lot of work, in feminist philosophy of science, in legal scholarship, in, philosophy of AI, about the fact that these decision thresholds are morally significant. So where to place some kind of threshold ought to be determined in part by how one ought to trade off harms from false positives to false negatives. So, citing the kind of inductive risk argument in philosophy of science, where there you're making a decision about, say, what your evidence supports, and what your evidence supports, you think the kind of threshold for whether or not your evidence supports one thing or another ought to be sensitive to the stakes of placing the threshold at a certain place, the ways in which we need to trade off the kind of false positives and false negatives. So I think this is a really important thing that is being a little bit recognized in computer science, but I think there's a lot of interesting work to do to kind of help people designing these systems out in the world think through, where they put a kind of threshold impacts, the number of false positives and false negatives that you'll get, and thereby questions of fairness. Second, a commonly accepted requirement of fairness, the kind of idea of equal treatment that we talked about, is that we ought to be using the same decision threshold for everyone. So it would be really unfair if, I'm a banker, I get someone in front of me and I'm like, you look really trustworthy. Sure, you were only predicted to be like 40% likely to pay back this loan, but I think that's the right threshold in this kind of case. Let's give you a yes decision. Get someone else in front of me and I'm like, just not looking very trustworthy. I mean, you're predicted 60%, but 60 is not that high, it's not like 80. So I think in this case, you're not going to get the loan. That's the right place to put that threshold. Mm-hmm. So the idea is we really ought to be using the same decision threshold for everyone for these reasons of equal treatment or fairness, that kind of notion of fairness. But I think there are other kind of fairness concerns that you might have about thresholds. from this Broomian perspective of fairness. So here's the very, very simple argument from this conception of fairness to the fact that I think decision thresholds under some conditions will be unfair. So first, this is just an articulation of our commitment that comes from adopting the Broomian view. So it's unfair if people with claims never had any chance ex ante to get some desired good. Second, just empirical claim. Some decision thresholds will deny people with weaker claims a chance at the desired goods, e.g. under conditions of scarcity. So, there's a way of using thresholds where we would just use them to say like, divide people who had no claims to something from some who do. So you might say kidneys. We've got loads of kidneys, like so many kidneys, but some people want kidneys but have zero claim to them. Like they just, they really like eating kidneys. So we don't want to be giving them our valuable kidneys just to eat. They have no claim to that kidney. We have a lot of them, but not enough of them to give to those people. So we need a kind of decision, procedure that just, we can predict who are the people who apply who want to be eating the kidneys, and we just make sure we don't give it to those people, but everyone with some claim does get a kidney. That's like a way that you could use a decision threshold that doesn't violate the Broomian view. That tends to not be how we use them because we're operating under, as I mentioned earlier, kind of supposed conditions of scarcity. The idea that, look, we've only got so much of something, all of you have a claim to it of differing strengths, and only some of you can get it. So in using decision thresholds, we say, and everyone who falls below this threshold will not get the good. And, we're going to, so we conclude, have fairness reasons not to use these decision thresholds when they deny people with weaker claims a chance at the desired good. And here's importantly where the monoculture idea also comes in. The idea is, we're using the same kind of set of, inference and decision rules in order to make these decisions. So people can know ex ante if they fall below this threshold, then they'll have no chance at the good even across multiple decision makers because they're all using the same set of decision rules. All right, so to sum up this argument, fairness requires, as we just saw, that people have a chance at some outcome in proportion to the strength of their claim. Decision thresholds sometimes deny those with some claim and outcome any chance at it, and in these kind of cases, decision thresholds will be unfair. So the Broomian sort of solution is to use weighted lotteries. These give individuals a chance at the outcome in proportion to their claim, where the weights in the lottery will represent the strength of their claim. So take a bank that uses a kind of AI system to, this should be predict creditworthiness. So the AI system might generate a continuous prediction of likelihood to pay back a loan. Let's say we group individuals into kind of bins based on that prediction, like people 10 to 30% go in bin 1, bin 2 is people less than so. And then we think, okay, maybe people 80 to 100% have got this strength of claims, people in the next bin have this strength of claims, and then we kind of run a lottery based on which bin, the kind of weights assigned to each of these bins, and then people get kind of outcomes based on this lottery. It's how you can imagine the kind of Broomian alternative to this picture, to the decision threshold picture going. All right, so in the final kind of 10 minutes or so, I want to switch gears a little bit. So the Broomian picture, presupposed a couple of things. It presupposed we had a good understanding of what people's claims are, at least well enough to kind of assign certain weights to those claims. We were using these weighted lotteries where, the weights were representing some kind of, the strength of claims. So we have some randomness, but it's really tied into this. The lottery is really kind of centered around these weighted claims. So in the rest of the talk, I want to kind of explore some reasons to insert what we might call kind of, genuine randomness into AI systems, insert some noise. Think about why do we have reason to do some more random decision making where we think there's, not in terms of a kind of better understanding of people's claims, but more in terms of the kind of rolling the dice. All right, so here I think there are both epistemic reasons and reasons of justice to insert some amount of genuine randomness. I'm not going to argue that we should it'd be fair if we do kind of all decision-making by rolling dice between people, but I think actually the kind of fairness of our decision processes actually kind of have relied on there being a little bit of noise in them. They're not kind of, perfectly accurate. And once we kind of, reduce the noise more and more, I think we kind of see that actually, this kind of randomness was integral to making these decision systems fair. Okay. So the first kind of epistemic reason is more of a short-term reason. So in many cases, inserting some kind of randomness, at least in early stages, is important for gathering evidence. So the kind of based on the data that you have, as well as maybe the learning process you use, you may not end up with models that are very predictive or kind of equally predictive across relevant groups. So you might have reason to think that actually you end up with a model that's like not very predictive at all due to features of the data or the learning. So we're better off just doing random decision making in the short term to gather more information. So for example, Richardson et al. Have discussed this problem of dirty data, what they call dirty data. So they're kind of legal and sociological scholars working in the US context, where they think because the police have fabricated so much evidence at crime scenes, and in general, the kind of data produced by policing is so unreliable as to who has actually committed crimes. Actually, we can't build any kind of predictive models on the basis of those data because they just, they don't give us a kind of accurate picture of what the world is like. So because of some kind of, background conditions in which our data was generated, or if you think that there's, for example, some kind of non-stationary data generating processes that, we have data, say, about how people in different age groups, voted in the last election, but people's political preferences are kind of changing over time. The kind of, background processes that generate your preference for one or another party change drastically across age groups. So all those past data are kind of unreliable when it comes to future performance. In a lot of cases, there's good reason to think, we just can't do very good predictions. So basing any kind of decision on those predictions, would be in fact worse than kind of doing it randomly. Second point, we might have models that aren't equally predictive across relevant groups. So, in aiming to learn a model, we're trying to minimize expected predicted error. And this is compatible with a kind of large predictive error for a small proportion of the population. So knowing that, we might think that for those people, we actually need to gather some evidence. The model might not be very predictive for them, or we might not know that because, say, we've got a model that, again, is giving out loans. We're not very good at people who, let's say we live in a country where we don't get much immigration, but our model performs very poorly for those who recently immigrated because they don't have some kind of credit history in our country. But since there's such a small proportion of the population, we're not really aware of that. We've got a lot of predictive error for them, but overall, we've got a highly performing model. And we're not kind of like gathering relevant data about whether or not those people would have paid back loans because we always deny them loans. So we just don't have any good data in order to base a better model. So there are good reasons to do kind of, random allocation just for evidence gathering. So I have friends who work in public health, and they tell me this is quite common in public health, that you think you have some sense of how an intervention will work. There's a lot of uncertainty. So what you might do is, alongside kind of rolling it out in what you think is the most kind of welfare enhancing way, also roll it out in a way that functions basically as like a mini RCT that allows you to gather more data in order to do better kind of evidence-based interventions in the future. So inserting some randomness in the short term can provide more information about types of individuals, leading to more accurate prediction in the long term. And that might help us, for example, learn more population-specific predictive models. We can say, okay, for the group of recent migrants into a country, credit history is not a good predictor of creditworthiness, but we might learn other features about them that's a good predictor, kind of population-specific features. So just one example, Hu and Chen in a 2018 paper propose a kind of two-stage procedure in the job market, which I think is a really cool idea. First, so you randomly choose candidates for, say, year-long internship from a pool of those that meet some minimally demanding threshold. You gather evidence about how various people performed, and like background assumption, there's a kind of suitably supportive environment for all of those people that you've hired. You get a bunch of evidence about them, then stage 2, hire the most qualified. So they're imagining, a case where you've got a society where there's a lot of background injustice. There'll be a bunch of people who say, would be excellent, accountants, but they didn't go to the fanciest accountant school because of their kind of, previous access to education. So a way to get around that at the kind of job stage, assuming you can't intervene earlier, a way to gather more evidence is step 1, just randomize. See how people perform, maybe supplement with some additional training. Stage 2, okay, now you have better data about who's the most qualified accountant, go ahead and hire them. This kind of argument is an argument for a little bit of randomness in the short term. However, a thing I was thinking about is, back to this issue of, not having good enough data. Sometimes we might think we just can't gather more evidence. So in a kind of situation in which we can't gather more evidence, we can't get a kind of suitably good view or kind of suitably accurate predictive model for some groups, and we know that. Maybe the kind of fair thing to do is to make the model a little bit worse across the board, or a little bit more noisy across the board, in order to give people at least some chance at the thing, even though we can't reliably pick out those people. So here's a kind of example of what I had in mind. And so the background idea is there might be kind of privacy or interest-based or just kind of institutional reasons why the modeler can't get the data that she needs to learn a more predictive model for members of some group. So say we have a model to predict creditworthiness that uses yearly income as reported by official payslips. Say we have undocumented immigrants. We live in a country where there are not open borders. People only can work in a country under certain conditions. Some people are working there even though they don't have legal permission. They receive a regular income. Let's say they can kind of like even turn in their tax statements to report that they pay taxes on some income, but both them and the unemployed don't have payslips reporting a yearly income, nor kind of proof of work. So the bank can't see, you've got a job that will be kind of giving you this much for this amount of time because you don't have a contract and you don't have these official payslips. So we've got a model, and let's say that we even have a kind of representative data set. In our data set, we have a bunch of people who both are unemployed and undocumented immigrants, but we don't have kind of labels for each of them because the kind of undocumented can't provide or don't want to provide information about themselves to distinguish themselves from the kind of unemployed. But members of the former group, let's say, are creditworthy. If you've got this kind of situation where okay, we've got some kind of people who are creditworthy, but we can't distinguish them from the non-creditworthy, maybe, and this is, I think, a big open question, but what would be fair is to introduce a little bit of randomness in your decision process. You'll get some kind of like false positives, people who didn't deserve the loan, but ended up getting one anyways, but at least some people who are kind of left out of the decision procedure before, where you couldn't learn an accurate model about them, at least have some chance. So that's one example. Curious what you think. The kind of second, or the kind of justice-based reason, so the final reason is, how to put it? I think the final kind of justice-based concern really centers around the arbitrariness of a lot of the decisions we make in the modeling process. So both kind of the arbitrariness of the criteria that we choose to kind of pick out who's a good employee. Say, do we think a good employee is the one who lasts at the company for a long time? Are they the ones who make the most sales? It's kind of an arbitrary decision which criterion we pick. And there are a bunch of arbitrary decisions along the way in the modeling process as well, like what data do we collect, how do we characterize the data, which features do we pick out, all of these various things. And because of this arbitrariness, I think, people have a kind of complaint if they had no chance at kind of what they want because we've used a somewhat arbitrary decision process. So I'll motivate that and then say a little bit more about it. So the first kind of big claim of this argument, people have an autonomy-based interest in being able to develop and exercise their talents, or a kind of interest in being able, or kind of equality interest in having equal standing compared to others. So people have an interest in living in a society where, say, a bunch of jobs are available to them where they could develop and exercise talents that they care about. Second, the organization of production and government gives some greater scope to develop and exercise their talents, or some greater power over others and prestige because they occupy these positions of privilege, just a fact. And what justifies having these positions? So this is a kind of, core thing that political philosophers have worried about, right? Some people get to be president, some people get to be CEOs, some people get to have more money than others. How on earth can be justified if we start off from a baseline of autonomy, or a kind of baseline where we think everyone should have equal access to these valuable opportunities for autonomy-based reasons? Standard kind of justification. Well, we've got equality of opportunity. Anyone can be fill it in, doctor, accountant, philosopher, all these good things. But, and here's what I mentioned before, particular criteria are going to privilege arbitrary talents. So, let's take doctors. We could live in a society where what's really important to be a doctor is that you're a great listener, right? Being a doctor is all about identifying what conditions people have, getting them the right treatments. Correct me if I'm wrong, my experience of doctors is that they're not chosen because they're great listeners. They're chosen based on other criteria, like knowing a lot about biology and memorizing various facts about drugs and all these kind of things, appropriate treatments. So there are a bunch of people who maybe wanted to be great doctors, don't have the capacious memory skills, but would be great listeners. The way we've set up the medical system just privileges people who are kind of good at certain things. But we might think, it's kind of unfair if we have a society where people had no chance at being doctors. Even if, we have equality of opportunity just means if you happen to have the kind of arbitrary talents that the physician rewards, then you get the thing in question, but people don't always have those talents. So you might think individuals have a kind of equal claim to some real chance at positions of power and privilege, even if we think, okay, we have good reason, once we say like to be a doctor, you have to have a really high scores on these tests, we should still mostly go by that, but maybe it's unfair if we don't, add a little bit of randomness into our decision process, because those people who maybe, didn't score as highly but have these other valuable skills ought to have a kind of shot at being a doctor. That's the thought here. And the standardization in decision-making and the kind of interconnected decision processes that AI enables help us see this. So again, I think in the past, decision makers chose people based on kind of often just totally arbitrary reasons. So there was always a little bit of noise in our decision processes, but this might be disappearing over time. So this kind of argument is different from the Bergman argument in that it's an argument for, kind of apart from what your particular claims are, we just ought to add a little bit of randomness because everybody should be on an equal footing in some kind of minimal sense to have a chance at the thing that they care about. All right, apologies. I said I would end on time and I've done quite the opposite, but thank you for listening and I look forward to your questions.